All right. Chapter 31, American Life in the Roaring Twenties, 1919 through 1929. Okay, intro to this chapter. Americans after World War I were, one, sick of war, but two, also very disillusioned about how it ended. Remember, we never quite got the Treaty of Versailles passed. The big issue over the League of Nations more or less was a dud. So Americans were really disillusioned. They're over war, and they really started to look inwards. They started to look at America again. You can think of the 20s as kind of like the turtle 20s, right? A turtle sticks his head in his shell and forgets about everything else. Well, that was America in the 20s. We didn't want to be involved in all of these foreign affairs, foreign politics. Yep. And we started to shun really anything as we saw as an un-American lifestyle. We wanted less immigration. We wanted less commitment to other nations. And the 20s is really an era that's known for a culture, a very distinct culture in American life. We see an increase in income in most families, an increase in the standard of living across the board. We see new technologies, new consumer products that you could buy on credit, like a washing machine, that sort of thing. Of course, new forms of leisure and entertainment as well. But just below the surface in this really kind of outgrowth of culture, we see a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, about the future and about the fact that a lot of America's traditional values are changing. So there's a lot to go over. This is, again, it's kind of like a culture chapter, right? Okay, so section A, seeing red. Okay, red refers to communism, right? Anytime we really hear red in history, we're talking about communism. So, of course, we know in World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia, 1917, 1918. We see the Tsar and his family are killed, kind of like their royalty, so to speak. They're killed, and it set up a new communist government in Russia. Okay, well, people in America, because of this revolution in Russia, started to become kind of fearful, you could say, of something similar happening in America. So a lot of people did not like the left wing, right? The socialists, the communists, definitely distrusted. And also, we see at the end of war kind of this epidemic of strikes, some of which we've talked about before. But a lot of these strikes, people are now starting to blame communism on these strikes. For example, in 1919, there was a strike in Seattle. And these strikers, they had modest demands. They were very orderly, but still the people near Seattle and Washington State just made this huge uproar about it, demanding that the governor, or is it the mayor, whomever, the mayor call in federal troops to stop this strike. They called it, the anarchy of Russia among us. So that we can see people are violently protesting strikes as something that's kind of communist. Okay. We also have preachers preaching against the horribleness, which is communism. Billy Sunday is an example of one. He is a hellfire preacher, and he described a Bolshevik, or we can say in our case, a communist, as, quote, a guy with a face like a porcupine and a breath that would scare a polecat. So seeing, anti-communism even on the pulpit. And this whole kind of anti-communism fervor that happens right after World War I is referred to as the First Red Scare. Okay, first kind of indicating the fact that there'll be a second, but that'll be for the 40s. We're not there yet. So the rest of the section really kind of sets up different examples of, the Red Scare, so to speak. Probably the biggest name with the Red Scare you ought to know is the Attorney General at this time, A. Mitchell Palmer. And, he saw red everywhere. So he was looking to, root out communism wherever he could find it. He actually, rounded up about 6,000 suspects during his reign, you could say, as Attorney General. And his home was actually bombed in 1919. He did not have a lot of friends, to say the least. He's known as the Fighting Quaker. Okay, wait, pause. Okay, we're historians here. We're like Fighting Quaker, A. Mitchell Palmer. What the heck, A. Mitchell Palmer? The Fighting Quaker we know is, of course, Nathaniel Greene. Remember that guy, the Fighting Quaker from the Revolutionary War? Okay, unpause. Well, Fighting Quaker, A. Mitchell Palmer, definitely kind of the figurehead of the first Red Scare. Other things that happened in December of 1919, in our fervor to get rid of these communists, we actually deport 249 alien radicals to Russia. So about 250 people, we round them up, put them on a boat, the Buford, and kind of just send them off to Russia. Just deport them. Yay, America. Okay, September 1920, there is a bomb on Wall Street that killed 39 people and injured several hundred more, and that's pinned, of course, on those horrible communists, that sort of thing. So a lot of events happening. So let's talk about on a state level now. On a state level, we see a lot of kind of new anti-communist laws passed. They're called criminal syndicalism laws. Syndicalism? That's a word, apparently. Anyway, these laws outlawed the advocacy of violence to bring about social change. And really, these laws were pointed at the Wobblies. Remember, the Wobblies are kind of the nickname for the members of the IWW. And these, Wobblies would give stump speeches talking about, revolution and all of these kind of very liberal, very socialist, very communistic ideas. So these laws are kind of passed to hinder, you could say, their freedom of speech. Just another example of showing how much America hated communism, hated socialism. In New York State, we're talking at a state level, of course, in New York State, 5 members of the legislation who were elected completely, validly, they show up to Congress and they're refused to be seated. They refused to seat them because they were socialists. They're like, nope, we don't have socialists here. Although the people elected you, go away. So Red Scare definitely going about. And some businessmen really took advantage of this Red Scare. Remember, the Red Scare is also associated with, a unpopularity, we should say, of unions. Well, some businesses took advantage of that. And what we see in kind of response to this is something called the American Plan. The American Plan is more or less a policy where employers would, yes, that's the right word, where employers would have kind of open shops, which said when you hire someone new to work in your factory, that they had to sign a contract that said they would not join a union. Okay, remember, we talked about these before. They're kind of called yellow dog contracts. You sign them saying that if I work here, I will not join a union. So we see a lot of that spread during this kind of, Red Scare right after World War I. And because of this, we see kind of a decline in unions in the 20s. Okay, you can't talk about the first Red Scare without talking about Zacco and Vanzetti, okay? So what happens is these two guys, they are Italian, they are anarchist, they are atheist, and they definitely kind of just draft dodgers, everything Americans hate at this time. They are it. So what happens is they get convicted of a murder. A guy in Massachusetts, a paymaster and his guard were murdered, and this murder was pinned on these two guys. And a lot of people say very unfairly so. They said, you're just pinning it on Zacco and Vanzetti because they're immigrants, because they're anarchists, because they're, everything that you don't like. Just because you don't like them doesn't make them criminals. So anyway, this is a very big case. This is an international attention goes on this case. And what happens is, in effect, they are convicted. They're actually electrocuted, so they're killed. And, people across the country, people across the world really see them as martyrs. These people, they were just convicted. They didn't have enough. A lot of people thought there wasn't enough evidence to really convict these folks of murder, and that the only reason they were convicted is because the judge and the jury were prejudiced against them. We have, 20/20 vision later on history. we have a little more of the facts. And actually, probably Sacco was guilty, but Vanzetti was probably innocent. But nonetheless, this is just an example of the Red Scare, of Americans being prejudiced against, non-Americans, against immigrants, against, anarchists, against atheists. This is a prime example of that. All right, section B, hooded hoodlums of the KKK. Well, you know what? The KKK, it's kind of reborn again in the 1920s. We'd seen it first after the Civil War during Reconstruction, but really we see the KKK being reborn in the 1920s, and they're kind of moving north. So we see really they're in the South as well, but we really see them in the North this time too. And this time they're not just anti-black, but they're anti-foreign-born, or anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-communist, anti-pacifist, anti-evolution, anti-bootlegging. So they're really kind of like a very extreme form of ultra-conservatism. So we're seeing a lot of liberal ideas. We have socialism, communism, that sort of thing. So kind of, you could say, in reaction to this, we have the extreme opposite side, right? We have the ultra-conservatives in the form of the KKK. Let's see. They'd spread quickly in the 20s, especially in the Midwest, in the Bible Belt of the South as well. At its peak, they had about 5 million due-paying members. Let's see. Eventually they do collapse rather suddenly in the late 20s because there was this kind of, they were exposed as this kind of money-making scheme, so to speak. What happened is when someone would join the KKK, they had to pay a $10 initiation fee. Well, 4 of those $10 would actually go to the person who recruited them. And when this was exposed, a lot of people just fell out of favor with the KKK. They saw it as corrupt, although they were totally corrupt all along. But they saw them as corrupt, just kind of out there to make money. So we do see a rise in the KKK in the 20s, and we see that kind of rapidly decline at the late 20s. But they'll be back. Don't worry about that. Section C, stemming the foreign flood. All right. So after World War I, kind of the floodgates of immigration came again. So we see right after World War I, 1920 to 1921, about 800,000 immigrants, again, kind of these new immigrants from South and Western Europe flood into America, okay? And a lot of people, kind of this hyper-nationalism wanted to see this immigration stop. Once again, we saw people who were, we want only 100% Americans. We don't want these immigrants coming in. They started to complain again after World War I. And we see on the federal level a couple of acts passed to limit immigration. The first act was the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. And what this did is it said, they're limiting immigration from different nations, from different nationalities. So this first act, the 1921 Act, looked at the census of 1910 and said, okay, we'll allow, making this very straightforward. Say there was 100 Italians living in America. Obviously, there's a whole bunch more. But say there's 100 Americans living in 100 Italians living in America in 1910. Well, this act said 3% of those Italians could emigrate to the United States, or 3% of that population could emigrate. So saying, okay, if there's 100 Italians in 1910, 3 Italians from Italy could immigrate. Okay. I hope that wasn't confusing. That was supposed to be an example. But the thing was, there were so many, people from South and Eastern Europe living in the United States in 1910 that really this first act didn't really limit much. Mostly everyone who wanted to come could still come. So, to amend this problem, they passed a second act called the Immigration Act of 1924. And what they did with this is they lowered the percentage. So instead of 3%, they lowered it to 2%. And instead of looking at the 1910 census, they looked at the 1890 census. In 1890, there was this was before really we had that first wave of the new immigrants. So there was a lot less people who were able to immigrate in the United States because of this Immigration Act of 1924. For example, we're setting up a quota, so the kind of a cap on how many people could immigrate. So since we're looking at the 1890 quota, we see people in Great Britain and Ireland, we see every year that cap was set at about 66,000. But we see the cap for Italians set out about 6,000 because there weren't a lot of Italians in 1890. Makes sense? I hope it does. If not, just read your book. What a novel idea. Okay. Also a part of this Immigration Act of 1924, we see a section that actually completely closed the door on any new immigration from Japan. So we're closing the door on Japan's immigration. Okay? Japan in true form, they protest. We keep seeing Japan protest. And what happens is they have some, hate America rallies in Japan. In one very extreme circumstance, a Japanese man killed himself in front of the American embassy in Tokyo to protest this kind of closing off of Japanese immigration. Kind of as a caveat to this, we did make some exceptions. We did allow any Canadians who wanted to come to America to come, and also those from Latin America. We didn't prevent any of those folks from coming because they were useful to us, right? They'd come, especially from Latin America, they'd come working on farms seasonally, they'd go back home when jobs kind of ran scarce. So we didn't, they were kind of an exemption, the Canadians and the Latin Americans. Okay. So although, the 20s brought the quota system for immigration, we did still have about 35 million immigrants that were already in America that had come over the last 100 years, the last century. And really, we see kind of a patchwork of different ethnic communities along the coast and within the United States. And, not everyone was against immigration. Some people thought this was a wonderful thing. And we kind of have two perspectives brought forth from those who thought immigration was wonderful. The first perspective is kind of called pluralism. Pluralism, okay? The guy who really was the speaker for pluralism, his name was Horace Kallen. And Horace said, talking about how Germans were really prevented from being true German during World War I, he said that's a bad thing. We should let ethnic groups keep that culture they brought with them. We should allow them to be truly German. We should allow them to be truly Irish. We should allow them to be truly Italian. And his analogy was kind of like different instruments in a symphony. He wasn't for a melting pot where all of the cultures melted together. Colin really thought that each culture should live side by side, allowing them to kind of really retain their uniqueness as a culture, their language, that sort of thing. Okay. Another group of people who were kind of against this quota system were called the cosmopolitanism. Okay, cosmopolitanism. The spokesperson for that, more or less, his name was Randolph Bourne, and really he wanted a mix of ethnicity, kind of like multiculturalism, transnationalism, and the analogy he used was kind of like a cloth being woven together with many different colored threads. So, not everyone was against this quota system. Okay, Section D, the Prohibition experiment. Okay, so we see Prohibition as being one of the last really efforts put forth from our progressives. We see progressives are slowly kind of dying out, and really the last thing they do is pass what is the 18th Amendment, which ends alcohol in America. A lot of women and a lot of churches obviously supported this 18th Amendment, and this 18th Amendment happened in 1919. And we'll see, Prohibition era really lasts between the 18th Amendment in 1919 and the 21st Amendment that will repeal it in 1933. So just 1919 to 1933, that's kind of the era of Prohibition when alcohol was illegal in the United States. Okay, so to really enforce this 18th Amendment, Congress passes something called the Volstead Act. Okay, the Volstead Act, enforcing the 18th Amendment, prohibited the manufacture, sale, transportation of alcoholic beverages. All right, and this measure, the 18th Amendment was really popular, especially among the South and in the West. In the West, they had been really working hard to get rid of this kind of saloon culture. So that included alcoholism, included prostitution, corruption, and crime. So this was seen as a positive thing in the West, trying to get rid of all of that corruption, saloon culture. And in the South, some people thought it was a good thing because it would keep the blacks in line, make sure they didn't step over the line because they were, in a drunken rage or something to that effect. Praise the Lord. Okay. What else do we need to know? People who were definitely against it were kind of these new immigrants, people that had these old world traditions where drinking was a part of their culture, right? They're used to beer gardens and to taverns, and to, just drinking was a part of their culture. So they were definitely the ones that were against it. And the idea here is, the United States had never really tried to enforce a law that the majority, or you could say a strong minority of people were against. And they couldn't really enforce it well. They didn't have enough people, and the people they had weren't paid enough, so a lot of the people who were supposed to enforce these laws would be really susceptible to bribes. So really, it was really hard to enforce, and a lot of the poorer people complained about it. They're like, okay, so now we can't buy our cheap beer, but all these rich guys can buy as much illicit booze as they want to because they have enough money to pay for it. So they're kind of ticked off. Also, soldiers coming back from World War I, they came back to, a dry America. No alcohol for you. And they're like, what? I mean, I was fighting overseas and I come back and this happened? So they were kind of ticked off too, or surprised to say the least. Yep. We see a lot of these booze coming from the West Indies. I'm seeing the illicit booze. They're coming illegal, illicit, same thing. They're coming from the West Indies. A lot of it's actually coming from Canada. Some people, make it themselves, moonshine, bathtub gin, that sort of thing. However, a lot of this bathtub gin was very dangerous because it's obviously not regulated. It could go wrong. Some people actually went blind. Some people actually died by drinking some of this homemade alcohol. But, this noble experiment of Prohibition, it did have some, it did reach some of its goals. In general, savings increased, so people were spending less money on alcohol. At least that's the theory. Also, less people missed work due to drunkenness the night before. And on a whole, there's just less consumption of alcohol. So it wasn't all a failure. This noble experiment did work to some extent. All right, section E, the golden age of gangsterism. I'm so not qualified. All right, we're going to talk about it anyway. Okay, so making alcohol illegal really made the speakeasies really a big business, or selling of illicit, illegal alcohol into a big business. And we see a lot of rival gangs starting to fight each other for control over this black market in alcohol or in booze. They had sawed-off rifles, they had typewriters, which was just the nickname they gave to machine guns, and they would kill the competition. So yeah, definitely the era of the gangster, and nothing really shows this better than Chicago. Chicago is, the typical gangster city in the 20s. We see in the 20s, Chicago alone, 500 mobsters are killed in these kind of rivalry fights between these different gangs. Although we see a lot of mobsters killed, we actually see very few people arrested for this kind of bootlegging gangster crimes, and we see even less are convicted. especially in Chicago, we have to talk about Scarface, right? Al Capone. Al Capone more or less ruled Chicago for 6 years, making millions, if not, did it say billions? No, he made millions and millions off of selling alcohol, being a bootlegger, but, it was very violent, and his life was definitely under attack. He drove around in this armored car with bulletproof glass. He really ruled the city of Chicago. And what happened in 1929 was something called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And what happens is 7 disarmed or unarmed members of Capone's rival gang are kind of shot in cold blood. And everyone knows it's Capone, but they can't quite pin it on him. Finally, Capone is arrested due to tax evasion, right? Falsifying income tax records, and he's thrown in jail. Well, after about 10 years or so in jail, he's released because he's suffering the side effects of syphilis. He had contracted syphilis in his youth, and now 20 years later or so, it starts to mess with your brain. So he's released because more or less he's mentally incompetent. He's kind of losing his mind. They don't see him as a threat anymore. So he actually goes off to his Florida mansion where he spends the rest of his life in this kind of very childlike state. In 1946, they actually, bring him into a doctor, and the doctor says, you have about the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. So there's some kind of funny, weird stories about him in the latter years of his life, sitting by his pool in Florida and fishing in his bathrobe in his pool. So he's a little bit crazy. And then finally in 47, he'll actually die of a heart attack. Don't be a gangster. You'll end up in Florida fishing out of your bathtub. Okay, so besides, gangsters being bootleggers, we really see the rise of racketeers in general. Okay, a racketeer is just the name for a person who obtains money illegally through the use of fraud, bootlegging, threats of violence, gambling, etc., etc., etc. So besides just bootleggers, we see people getting involved in prostitution and gambling and selling narcotics, aka drugs. Sometimes what they do is they go up to like an honest merchant, the local shoe store, and they would sell them protection, which more or less means give us money or we'll come back later on tonight, break through your windows, we'll overturn your trucks, we'll beat up your employees. So sometimes through these threats of violence, they'd make money as well, these racketeers. And by 1930, organized crime, right, these gangsters had made somewhere between 12 to $18 billion a year, so a huge industry. Anyway, this section in this video, for that matter, will end kind of by talking about Charles Lindbergh. Okay, Charles Lindbergh, obviously, he was one of the first celebrities we see in America. Everyone knew who Charles Lindbergh was. He was the first person to fly solo, nonstop across the Atlantic. So he flew from New York to Paris. And because of that, he became very, very famous, kind of American hero. Everyone knew about him. Well, unfortunately, in 1932, his infant son was kidnapped and held for ransom. They paid the ransom, but never got the child back. Later on, they found the child's body. The child had been killed. And we see Congress pass something called the Lindbergh Law, which more or less makes interstate abduction in certain circumstances a crime that could be punished by death. Okay, they just kind of threw it in there, so I'm throwing it back at you. Okay, with this, we're done with this chapter. Hooray. Not chapter, the video.